It's always wonderful to come here to the GCGC, and as usual, the organization is absolutely terrific. This paper came out of sort of by happenstance. Umakan and I were preparing for a conference that Paul Davies organized at Oxford, and we came across this World Bank ranking. And we were looking at 4 jurisdictions, at Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and India. And at that time, we didn't know much about the ranking. And we flipped it open. And lo and behold, we see that our jurisdictions ranked exceptionally high. So the World Bank does a ranking looking at the quality of regulation for related party transactions around the world. In Singapore, the jurisdiction that I'm most familiar with, ranked number 1 out of 190 jurisdictions. Hong Kong and Malaysia tied for number 3. India ranked 20, but again, that's out of 190 jurisdictions. You take the average of those, and if you go to the high-income OECD countries, all of our jurisdictions rank considerably higher than the high-income OECD countries. And if you look at Asia X, those are 4 Commonwealth Asian jurisdictions, they're considerably higher than the rest of Asia. So in other words, the impression that you're left with, looking at the World Bank yearly ranking for the quality of related party transaction regulation in Commonwealth Asia, I guess there's 2 things that it leaves you with. One is that the quality is very high in Commonwealth Asia, and the other is that it is relatively uniform. Then when we investigated the ranking more, we realized that there was a strong link between this ranking, a very strong link, and quite a prominent paper, The Law and Economics of Self-Dealing. And that's not an accident. Jankoff, who is one of the 4 authors in this paper, ended up at the World Bank, and he created the Doing Business ranking. And you see that the methodology that the World Bank uses very much is copied from this academic paper. And so we flip to this to the academic paper, to the section, to see in 2008 where our jurisdictions rank. And again, it's of course very similar because it's modeled on it, but you go back to 2008 compared to 2018, and you have a very similar picture. Singapore ranks first out of 72 countries they tested at that time, the only jurisdiction with a perfect score on their ranking. Hong Kong second, Malaysia third, and India 18 out of 72. Again, the picture is exceptionally strong in rankings, on these rankings. But Umakan and I then got together and we said, you know, do we care about rankings? Everybody always says rankings are stupid, they don't matter, especially university rankings. But then we always pick up the rankings and we look at them and we talk about them, right? So we said, should we waste all of our time looking at the rankings? And we had a serious debate about this. But what we discovered about these rankings, and we've been unearthing more and more evidence that we will build into the final version of this paper. Jurisdictions take this very seriously, and especially developing jurisdictions. So I was recently involved in the case in the Philippines as an expert witness, and I was doing research on the Philippine Companies Act. And I looked at the parliamentary debates in the Philippines about the new act, and they bring up their low ranking in the Doing Business ranking, and then they start to derive what sort of principles they need to build into their Corporations Act based on this, okay? I've had discussions in other countries, and I won't name them, in ASEAN because I was visiting on their faculties and people were involved in the process, but I can tell you countries set up committees where they look at these rankings and they build these in. So on a practical basis, these rankings, and this is what the World Bank intends them to do, right? The World Bank sets a standard and they release the rankings every year so that countries will work towards that standard. I didn't realize that the Jankoff paper has also been, of course, I knew it was an important paper, but it's been cited now 3,008 times the single paper. Not as big as the original LLS and V paper, about 10,000 sites, maybe the most cited law paper ever, but still very prominent with this number of cites. Now, what are the takeaways from the paper? One of the takeaways, which Jeff Gordon brought up in his chapter in the OUP handbook on corporate governance, convergence and persistence of corporate governance, he said this is the remaining sort of pillar supporting the legal origins theory, which many of you in this room know about. So it's important on that basis. But for the purpose of our paper, there is another critically important finding that comes out of the original paper and which really influenced the way that the World Bank set up its index, which is that private enforcement is critical for good regulation of related party transactions. If you look at the metrics that are being measured, it's all about ex ante disclosure and approval, ex post private enforcement. Okay, now the interesting thing, as I mentioned, both in the 2008 ranking and in the paper and in the World Bank rankings in successive years, Singapore has always ranked first. So you would think that Singapore would have a lot of private enforcement of related party transactions. So Umakan and I, we tried our best. We went back to 1965 when Singapore became a country, and we looked for private enforcement. Zero. There has never been an action brought in a listed firm to enforce directors' duties in a related party transaction case or for any other wrongdoing whatsoever. We couldn't even find an action that was filed in Singapore. So this started to raise questions for us. You have the #1 country for private enforcement, and they have no private enforcement. So we start to think, is the ranking making sense? And then we sort of had a bit of serendipity and timing. I'm sure all of you, or many of you, at least the people from Asia, but all around the world, you know about the Najib scandal in Malaysia, the Malaysian Development Bank, the one MDB scandal, right? This was a scandal which was executed through related party transactions. Malaysia ranks #3 out of 190 countries in terms of the quality of their regulation of related party transactions. Again, another question arises as to how this ranking is developed. Then we start looking a bit more sophisticated at the academic literature that has arisen in these jurisdictions, and we start to compare across our common law countries. And what do you notice? And you can also do a smell test. You start to ask lawyers, do you feel more safe, or investors, being a minority shareholder in Malaysia or India? Or do you feel more safe in Singapore or Hong Kong? And you'll uniformly get the same answer, which is I feel much more safe in Singapore and much less safe in Malaysia or India. And the limited, and it is limited, academic literature that has tried to weed out problematic wealth-reducing related party transactions does paint this picture, that there's a systematic problem in Malaysia with wealth tunneling through related party transactions. India has also its problems with this, and Singapore does not, but not because of private enforcement. Okay, so we describe two things in the paper. One is that Singapore probably deserves its high ranking, but for the wrong reasons, for different reasons than are identified if you think you view it through the lens of the World Bank ranking in the Jankoff paper. Malaysia does not deserve its ranking, and this is highly problematic in that sense. Also, in terms of, we looked at inter-jurisdictional difference, there's also this very interesting intra-jurisdictional difference. And what do I mean by that? Singapore and Hong Kong generally don't have systematic problems with RPT abuse, especially Singapore. But Singapore has had one black mark in its last 10 years in its corporate governance. And this has been with these so-called S-chip companies. An S-chip company is a company that is normally incorporated in a tax-free, so in the British Virgin Islands. They do all of their business in PRC mainland China, and then they do their IPO in Singapore, okay? And there has been many delistings, many huge scandals about massive wealth tunneling problems through blatant, you release your IPO and you tunnel your back to China and you're gone, okay? That blatant wealth tunneling. Now, this is, of course, not picked up at all because the way the index is constructed, it treats every type of shareholder within the jurisdiction exactly the same way. So the point that I hope I've convinced you of in this limited time is that there's a big gap. And the gap is between what the index in the original paper suggests should be happening in these jurisdictions and what, in fact, when you drill down deeper, is actually happening in these jurisdictions in terms of the quality of regulating the related party transactions. The natural question then becomes, how is this ranking constructed? How did they collect their information? And I was talking to Holger before my talk. Jankoff et al. Tried to do a step better than they did in the law and finance paper. And Holger really, I teach in my comparative corporate law class, I give his paper to show that this is empirical study gone wrong, right? And you all probably know the paper where Holger recoded what they did and all the statistical significance went away. So the Jankoff paper did a step better because they were careful in how they coded. What they did is they sent a hypothetical to lawyers in the 72 countries for the original paper, and the World Bank still does this. They send a hypothetical to 190 countries. Very good lawyers if you look at the countries it's going to. And here is the hypothetical transaction they set up. They say that there's a Mr. James. They use the same Mr. James in the academic paper as the World Bank, so you can tell how much it's modeled on it. It's the same name, the same transaction, and it's exactly the same. You have a company with a 60% owner who sits on the board of company A, he owns 90%, Mr. James, of company B, and he uses his control over the board to cause company A to purchase goods from company B at an inflated price, right? And so it's a classic wealth tunneling transaction where he's shifting the wealth from the company he owns 60% of to the company he owns 90% of. And then what they ask lawyers to do is they say, when you read this transaction, now we're going to give you 3 banks of questions. I don't have time to go through all the questions are in the paper, but I can summarize basically the types of questions. The first bank of questions is about ex ante disclosure and approval. So would you have to put this transaction in your annual report? If no, 0. If yes, 1. If you would have to put it in your annual report, the transaction, and disclose the conflict of interest, you get 2 points rather than 1. Okay? For approval, they say, would this have to be approved at the board of directors without the conflicted director? You get 1. Would it have to be put before shareholders as well? You get 2. Without the conflicted shareholder, you get 3. So that's the type of thing on the ex ante side. It's looking at disclosure and approval. On the ex post side, it's how do you sue and how can you hold the directors liable? So if you discover this transaction after the fact, can you bring an oppression remedy, a derivative action? Can you get access to the documents? Okay, and they allocate points for all of these things. On its face, it seems very reasonable, very well thought out. I have 5 minutes, so I better start moving. So what are the problems? What is missing from this analysis? Number 1, law in action. Okay, they asked lawyers in Singapore, can you bring an action? The coding is correct, you can. There's access to a derivative action and an oppression remedy. The question they should have asked is, would you have advised your client to bring an action? The answer is a definitive no, even for a first-year law student. Why? The reason is that the oppression remedy in Singapore is based upon informal relationships between shareholders. Those don't exist in listed firms where you purchase your shares online. You will never win a case if you understand the law. The derivative action, you're not allowed to charge contingency fees at all in Singapore. For listed firms, if you're a small shareholder and damages are paid back to the company, it's never going to be profitable most of the time, so a derivative action has never been filed in a listed company in Singapore, period. Okay, so this gives you an example of the wrong question being asked. It's not a coding problem, it's a question problem. Narrow focus. It focuses on these very narrow things in the law with corporate and securities law. Okay, now take the Malaysia case. There's no difference in the corporate securities law between Malaysia and Singapore, but there's a big rule of law issue there. Okay, so yes, we don't test for that in the problem. It's not a coding problem, again, it is a question problem. Oversimplification. The related party transaction I gave you is exceptionally simple. It's clear wealth tunneling. What don't you have in it? You don't have in it the biggest things in these Asian economies. State-owned enterprises. Curtis has written a great chapter in Luca's book, which is inspiration for this project as well. And this is just one part of the book on related party transactions. And it shows, Curtis with Mariana Pargendler, talk convincingly and show convincingly how state-owned enterprises are a different animal. They're driven by different incentives. There's different problems. In fact, we found in our jurisdictions there is different regulations, but in the wrong direction. We found that there's weaker regulations, have been loosened. Now we could talk more about why in Hong Kong and India, why they've loosened them for related party transactions with state-owned enterprises. Also with family firms and repeat related party transactions are a different animal than one-off, shaving off a little bit, okay? Stricter law is better law. There's nothing in the academic paper or the index which punishes you for over-strict regulation. You could make a rule saying pre-approval for related party transaction requires 100% of the shareholders, not just present and voting, but all the shareholders, and you'll never get approval in a listed firm because one person won't show up, okay? Now, you'll get a score of 100 on the index, okay? And we found evidence in our countries of too strict regulation trying to meet these criteria where the business community goes crazy because there are efficient related party transactions. We all know this based on the literature. Why do they all rank high? We agree with them on this. It's because they're all part of the Commonwealth. That's why they have the same rules on the books. Does that tell us anything? It tells us they're part of the Commonwealth, which is just legal copying. So then, with the very, I will have to bring up a lot of this in this discussion, but what we say is, then how do we better understand how related party transactions are actually working in these countries? And for that, we look at three types of complexity. One is we say there's huge regulatory complexity that goes far beyond these narrow criteria. It may go into rule of law. It may go into culture. It may go into your enforcement regime, Singapore vis-a-vis China. These are very localized, specific things which really get in the way of these cross-country massive studies. Shareholder complexity. Different incentives for different types of shareholders, different regulatory regime you need, and you need to take that into account. Again, I apologize, read the paper because I know I'm going to run out of time. We can talk about this, and I'm sure maybe Mike will have some comments on this as well. Normative complexity. Here's from the World Bank, RPD index focuses on one of the most serious breaches of good corporate governance around the world, the related party transaction. This is shocking. The assumption that is built in is that related party transactions are ipso facto bad. Okay? And that's why in the index, you don't get punished for being overly strict. Now, we all know there's a lot of great academic research by people in this room that clearly explain why related party transactions can be good. They can also be very bad. The key is, how do you filter the good from the bad? How do you reward the controlling shareholder less than the amount they're contributing to the governance of the firm? Okay? But this is not built into the index. Hugely problematic. Strict law is not necessarily good law. Okay, I end with a harsh conclusion. I don't really think the World Bank sucks. I know a lot of people who work for the World Bank. They're great people. They do great things. They do a lot of good. Where I think they suck is making laws for 190 countries. I don't think the World Bank should be in the business of setting these standards that then get copied and put in, because these are far too sophisticated issues to do in that manner. So the World Bank should build roads and bridges and do other things that they do very well. In terms of lawmaking, I do think they suck. Yeah, and the index as well, I would throw it also in that category. So the takeaways, I don't want to go over my time, and I think you're being generous to me now. Some of the implications. I think there's some serious implications which we haven't built into the paper yet, but we thought about more when we prepared this presentation. What is the damage that can be done to this? False hope. Okay, the Philippines puts this in. They think they're done with their regulation. It reveals possible solutions. When you just focus on the index, you don't ask, why does Singapore succeed? There could be a solution there that we're not looking at because we're zeroed in on the index. This challenges legal origins. I think Holger's already done the heavy lifting on most of this, but if this is the last pillar, according to Jeff, it maybe shows that this is still very tenuous. It opens up other paths to development. Singapore, since it's had a GDP per person on a purchasing power basis double of Japan and higher than Switzerland, has become more concentrated in its shareholding. And it has massive amounts of related party transactions because the biggest shareholder in the country is the government. And when you have that and your top 20 firms are almost all government controlled and they're banks and other institutions, of course you have massive related party transactions. It's a different developmental model. This opens up another door to development. I'm not saying the World Bank one isn't one model, but it opens up other possibilities. So with this, Umakan and I were hoping, with all hope, Singapore's ranked number one. Then we published this paper. We want them to be number one in 2019. They're not. They're number two. Number two out of 190. They're still pretty good. The question is, these are all for the flag buffs in the room. Who is number one? Anybody know the flag? Kenya. Why do I love this? Kenya's Commonwealth. I've started to dig into Kenya. They also looked at the index very much. But now I ask you the question. The question is, do you trust the World Bank and the Jankoff paper? If you do, go become a minority investor in Kenya and sleep well. If you think that it's a bit more sophisticated and complex, then you can come to our side. And with that, I just thank everybody very much. And I hope we'll learn a lot and get some good feedback from Mike. Thank you.
It's a reality check on economists. I think that is the second best role of a legal scholar, at least in this sort of setting. The first best would be for the economist to ask us first. I think people in this room might do that now, but there are others that won't, for reasons I actually don't understand at all. So, Dan and Umakan's proposition, we're going to talk a little bit more about the way it's framed and that sort of thing in fairly minor ways. The way I read this is that they looked at these two indexes, the World Bank Index and the DLLS Index, and they say it reflects the law in the books, but not the law in action. Now, they seem to treat that as a subset of their general proposition, but I think of the whole thing as that's what this is about. The source of the problem, failure to reflect regulatory complexity, shareholder complexity, and what they called normative complexity, but I just say fail to recognize that related party transactions may be good. Now let's step back for a second and look at governance indices. Again, some of you know I have a thing about this. So those are the possibilities. They can be simple, they can be too simple, or they can be just wrong or stupid. I wanted to say write stupid because it'd be all S's, but I didn't feel comfortable writing it, but I'll say it. Now, if they're simple, I think that's good. There's nothing wrong with an index. There's a lot right about an index, and they have to be simple. They have to simplify the world, just as any variable does. So that's good. That's the best hope. They may be too simple, though. And too simple, I would say, they may miss a variable, they may be fixable. So the question then would be, can they be fixed? And then the other possibility is they're just wrong. So LLS and V, wrong. Conceptually just wrong. Gomper's issue metric, conceptually wrong. I'll stop there. And there are others scattered around the literature. So one of my questions, so I'm going to use this to frame my comment, is where does this fall? And I'll go a little bit further along that line. So first, just want to get something out of the way. Someone could say this is a small sample. 4 companies out of, 72 or 190 something, depending on which index you're going to use. Small sample. 4 countries. Not a problem. Their point isn't to pick a random sample. Their point is to show conceptual problems for which one can fully expect extend through a lot of the countries. So I don't think there's a small sample problem at all. I think they could have written about 180 of them, but we'd have gotten bored by now. So I think it's very good the way they did this. So back to the sources of the problem. So failure to reflect regulatory complexity, and I'm going to actually fill in a little bit more than Dan had time for. Here's what they said. This is the bulk of it, I think, that the index ignores public enforcement. Now, only the World Bank ignores it. The DLLS one has it, but perhaps in a crude way. It happens that Malaysia and India have problems with enforcement, so the failure to with any, let me step back. Malaysia and India don't enforce well publicly or privately. That's a problem. There's a space there because I think I'm going to characterize these differently. Hong Kong and Singapore can't enforce against Chinese companies. And then there's some other important factors like the index doesn't take into account rule of law or culture or that sort of thing. So can or should this be fixed in order to create an index that is worth something or that is valid, that's usable? Failure to include public enforcement, that can be fixed. It may be a little bit hard, you won't do it perfectly, but that can be fixed. And as I said, the DLLS index does include enforcement. Now, Malaysia and India don't enforce well publicly or privately. That can be fixed, I think. I think you can come up with enforcement variables that would allow you to capture that if you built up the index a little bit more. Now, Hong Kong and Singapore can't enforce against Chinese companies. There's nothing to do about that, I don't think, but it doesn't strike me as a problem. You write a footnote that says, except Chinese companies. They're out of the jurisdiction. I suppose for Hong Kong that's a political statement, but they are out of the jurisdiction, and you can't get at their assets, and there may be rules in Hong Kong that don't allow you to get at their assets, even if you could get at their assets under Hong Kong law. But in any case, I think that's a footnote item. It doesn't strike me as a terrible problem. It's not a problem with Singapore law. It's not a problem with Hong Kong law broadly. Now, should you include rule of law and legal culture? You know, if you omit that, that's not the end of the world. You've got an imperfect index, but I don't know how you include that. And at some point, you can't include everything. So I think if you fix the public enforcement and you code Malaysia and India correctly, that this would be okay. Now we may disagree, and if we disagree, I suspect they're correct and I'm wrong. But that's my impression of this. Failure to reflect shareholder complexity. So here they talk about two types of companies. One is state-owned enterprises, and the other are family companies. There's a typo there. It says deserver. Family companies, they say deserve some leniency in the index. I don't really get that. I'm not sure why that's necessary. It seems to me that if they're family or not family, or they were family generations ago, I don't really see why that matters very much. Now, state-owned enterprises, if there are special rules for state-owned enterprises, and I'm not talking about the Chinese ones that are insulated by being out of the jurisdiction, but for instance, state-owned enterprises within Singapore, state-owned enterprises within Malaysia, well, if it's a country that has state-owned enterprises, then it seems easy enough to amend the index to account for that without huge encumbrance. It wouldn't become that complicated. So I think the first one could be fixed, and the second probably doesn't have to be fixed. And then the last one, related party transactions may be good, which is true. People have written this. There's every reason to believe this empirically and theoretically. But here I wonder, is there anything to fix? So the way you get 100% on the World Bank index or the DLS index is you disclose to shareholders or the board, and to get 100%, you may have to disclose to shareholders, I don't recall, and you get a 50% vote plus one. That seems to me to be a screen that's okay. If there's a good related party transaction, then it'll be explained to the shareholders. A majority of them will say, that's fine, we love it. I don't see a problem with that. Now, where could there be a problem? There could be a problem if there are countries, as Dan said, that have 100% shareholder requirement. well, that would be a problem. But my question then is, are there? And I think in their paper they talk about 75%. India. Okay. So that would be that could be a fix. I don't think there's a great reason for there to be a supermajority to approve these things. A filter or screen of 50% seems reasonable intuitively. So you could fix it, but I wonder how many that's going to really matter for. It seems like it's probably not a major fix. So here's my final point, and actually I can give you back a lot of your time, I think. How long have I have been pretty good, right? I don't need it. I'll give it back to him. He knows more than I do. So here's a broader question. This is an index, a governance index in the journals versus in action. Maybe we want to evaluate these differently. I think Dan implied that we do. That a governance index in the journals isn't going to hurt anybody. Now, LLS&V wasted an enormous amount of other people's time, including at least one person in this room. It's a shame. Other indices have wasted tons of our time. I guess I've wasted some of mine as a result of them. But it's not the end of the world. Now, the World Bank, the index is affecting things in the real world. So maybe if we're evaluating all of this, we should do it differently. So for an index in an academic journal, I think simple is good. That's what you should shoot for. I think too simple is not good, but maybe it can be fixed. I think wrong should be thrown away. But when we're talking about an index in action, then Dan knows this. He started to talk about it. I think he knows it much more than even reflected, because we discussed this on the way back from here yesterday. A lot of bad stuff can happen if there's an index. So maybe so I'm going to say, what is your conclusion, Dan and Umakant? Is even simple bad? Should there be no index unless it's, I'm not going to say perfect, but very, very good? Or if you could fix the index in the ways that I described, where I think you might agree that if you're fixing it for a journal, sure, we may learn something, it may be useful, but maybe that's not good enough for the World Bank. Maybe the standard should be higher when you're talking about an index in action. So that's my conclusion.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Mike. It's wonderful comments that, frankly, until this conference, I don't think Umakant and I had really thought about a number of these issues. So the first big point, which, and there may be a longer version or perhaps another paper has to come out of this, I do agree with you about this bifurcation of what you're using the index for. So I do agree that we have to think differently about indexes which have real-world consequences versus academic style indexes for academic use. And I think that there are parts, and I do like also the comment, sort of the spectrum that you put things on of whether it's just plainly wrong and can't be fixed or it's too simple. I think that's an interesting spectrum. I think with the RPT index, they're not going to throw it away, and I hope that some of this research can improve it. And there are things that could be done for the private enforcement side, before I get to public enforcement, that are critical, that I'm shocked aren't in there. And one thing which I didn't have time to, or I brought up just tangentially, but is critical, is contingency fees. Okay, because if you are dealing with enforcement through derivative actions or securities litigation, and you don't have contingency fees, that is a game changer in terms of incentives. So you look at the UK, to take it out of Asia as an example, they put into their 2006 Act, they put in the statutory derivative action. Okay, and the feeling was maybe you put it in and you're going to get a ton of actions, and there hasn't been a ton of actions, right? And it's an incentive problem. If you put in US-style contingency fees, you would start to see, like in Canada, there's a pickup in this, right? So these are things that could be built in to the World Bank index, which goes back to Mike's first point, which is why didn't they sit down and talk to lawyers about this? Because I think if they talked to the people who did the research on this, that would come out quite clearly. I do disagree with Mike. I disagree with him on the rule of law point. And the reason why I disagree is I think in the developed world, this may not matter, but the ones who suffer the most in terms of copying is the developing world. And if you don't have rule of law and you're trying to deal with public enforcement or private enforcement, you're dead in the water. And that's really a first order question that wipes everything else out. And so there are some indexes for this. There's ways to get at it, but I don't think you can just leave that out of the game because I think I was talking on the break to the Norwegian, the investor from yes, right there. And he said that they make investment decisions based on the index. And it's interesting to me that that happens, that the scores and the rankings on the index, but if they looked at Malaysia, maybe now with the scandal it's different, but before, and you see it as number 3, and you think I'll be a minority shareholder. But if you talk to any Malaysian colleague who's been doing research there, and now they've been able to release their research because of the government change. Before the government fell, none of them were willing. I supervised a thesis, and it was an excellent thesis, but they had to keep it confidential, and they couldn't publish the chapter because they were Malaysian and they wanted to see their family. And if it came out, they thought that they would have difficulty doing that. So now with the government change, all of this is coming out. But on the ground, people knew this. But if you have people in Norway looking at the index and saying we're number 3 and rule of law is not built in, you have a serious problem, right? So I do think rule of law is something that has to find its way in there. Public enforcement, yes, it was in the original paper with fines in that, but it was done in a very crude way. I think public enforcement in Singapore, if you wonder why I'm confident with RPT regulation generally, it has to do in the state-owned enterprises with the institutional architecture that's been built up to separate Temasek, the holding company, from influence in the board of directors. And it has to also do with the regulator being very good in public enforcement, but not in classic ways. So public enforcement's a big deal. It needs to be treated with a lot more sophistication. I think that could be done. But again, it would take a lot of work. Family firms, so I probably disagree with Mike a bit on this. I think he accepted our SOE difference, but not the family firm. Maybe it's a misclassification on our part because it's really more of a group company problem, repeat related party transaction problem. I think you're dealing with a very different animal in related party transactions when you're dealing with, in family firms, normally you will have a group of companies owned by family members, and they'll have relationships and transactions between the various holding companies, and it's multi-generational. So if it's a good family firm, you may not have the one-off related party transaction that you saw with the Chinese S-chips where they do an IPO, they take all the money and leave. They can't do that because they want to leave it to their family. And so they have to skim off a little bit, and you may be willing to accept that. But I do think it is far different than the fact pattern, and I think that there is some more difference. I don't want to go too much in time into that. I think that's about it. I don't want to eat up all of the time. Hopefully there'll be some questions. So I will leave it there. Just to thank Mike very much again for generating massively new thought and making me realize that there's still a lot more thinking to do on this. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thanks for mentioning me. Just to clarify that a little bit, it is true that corporate governance is a consideration in the allocation. My point was that you will have to take an allocation decision between different countries, and if you want to take corporate governance into account, it can be handy to have an index that includes so many countries. So if you would say there shouldn't be any index, in the real world there would still be an allocation decision. So I'm wondering what will be worse, to kind of make such a decision without any index, or make such a decision with an index which might not be optimal. So in that sense, I think in the real world, sometimes it's better to have something than nothing.
Yeah, so can I respond to that? So admittedly, we didn't look at this as much or almost at all from the investment side. We were more considering the regulatory side, right? That government's using this to create law. And I would be fascinated to talk more about why somebody, if they knew it, would be flawed. Why somebody, if they knew it would be flawed at a high level, would decide that we need to build corporate governance in? Is it because you feel that it's just a necessary to make your decision? But I haven't thought about it enough, but if it is very flawed, I would say that can be very dangerous. And again, I bring up the Malaysia example. If you were sitting in Norway and you see Malaysia ranked number 3, and you decide to allocate more of your investment to Malaysia rather than another country which should have been ranked ahead of them, I would think that that would be a decision that you would regret. Yeah? And so I think there could be problems with this. Maybe this goes back to Mike's point, though, and I think you raise a very valid point. In the real world, people need to make these type of decisions, and diversified investors that diversify geographically have to have some way of doing this in an inexpensive way. But the answer, I think, is not to say, well, the index is flawed and we have to use something, we just use it. I think it's to say, yes, we could maybe do a better job with this, and if there's a real need, we can address some of the concerns, like, for instance, the concern that contingency fees aren't built in, and that's a critical game changer, and maybe make these indexes better for that purpose, right? Yeah. Holger.
I've clearly spent way too much time thinking about these issues, but one of the issues that I thought about is what the use of an index like this is. And I don't think it's just about who uses it, but how it's being used. And one question here is a ranking versus a regressor.
Yes.
Or an allocation decision. You can have noise, it's not a problem if you have a regressor. It's better if you have no noise, but it's okay. If you use a ranking, then the noise gets amplified, to say the least. But perhaps more importantly, if it's being used in a way that invites gaming or does not. If you just state 20 rules you think are important, you sample them in all countries, get lots of noise, but by and large, if you get, you get some informative measure. But once people know that that's what you're doing, which is what you're talking about in the Philippines and in Kenya, well, okay, then now it becomes easy. There's 20,000 rules in the country, or 200,000 or 2 million or whatever. Let's change the 20 ones that those idiots at the World Bank or perhaps at other places are looking at, so that we look good on paper. And you start to game this thing, and then the index becomes completely uninformative. And that's not just an abstract thought. The World Bank itself has, in 2017, they have the World Development Report, where 2 researchers looked at the correlations of the indices with outcome variables now, not 10 years ago, but now, zilch, it's nothing. So it's a generalization of your point.
And this has real world. I was talking to Yupana about this last year with a paper, and it's never gotten off the ground, and it maybe never will. But the title that I was thinking of was something that would be called a corporate governance coup, and it would look at Thailand, because my understanding of Thailand is after the coup, when the military government took over, they were able to install a lot of people, independent directors on the boards of government companies who were military officials. So they're very independent. Of course, they know nothing about business or anything else, but Thailand finished at the top of the Asian Development Bank ranking for good corporate governance. And this has a legitimizing function for the government. Okay, so this also becomes sort of a political economy story where a government who's taken over in a coup can say, look at what we're doing. We're doing a great job. Why? Because we've moved up the rankings of the ADB good corporate governance, and now we're number 1. We're very efficient. We're serving a purpose here. And so this has weird knock-on effects that are strange when you get people reverse engineering, or as Holger correctly put it, gaming. Now, I have to be careful. With Kenya, I've only talked to, it was a student of Curtis's, and I've gotten some general indication that we haven't done in-depth research into Kenya, but there's enough on just the back of a napkin and some Google searches that suggests that the RPT regulation there is not ideal, right? And it would be something, again, maybe another paper, to go in and really verify these gaming things. That could be an analysis in and of itself, I think, yes. Lucian.
The general question is whether it's good to have the World Bank or somebody else, maybe GCGC, start very curious. Whether you are right, and one of you is right, in extra ways in which it can have bad effects. But there are also some good effects that we should recognize before we give it up. Why? Because that's not only gaming effect, but the alternative is to say, okay, the outsiders should stop. Let the Kenyan and the Malaysians do it. They are there, they know things. The problem is, that's not the benevolent dictator in Malaysia or the gods of corporate governance in Kenya. Those might be the local tycoons who might have even worse rules. So the advantage of the World Bank or groups like that is that they can put pressure from the outside and they might overcome some vested interests. So it's not really a competition between two simple Django and somebody will do a better job, but two simple Django and the tycoons of
So, yeah, go ahead. So I like this idea, but I think there is a bit of an assumption built in to your characterization of the World Bank, which I may want to sharpen a bit, which is the World Bank is not, in my estimation, a neutral party in this game. I think the World Bank has serious assumptions that they come in with, which is built upon an understanding of corporate governance from a U.S. perspective, right? And it's this idea about dispersed shareholding, the idea about the Commonwealth, like why does this resonate so well with Commonwealth countries and common law countries? 9 out of the top 10 countries are common law. I think it's the perspective that the World Bank is coming from. And you see this, for instance, after the East Asian financial crisis, when the IMF is like this as well. They went into Korea, for instance, to take one example, and they said, you need independent directors, okay? And they made a mandatory rule for independent directors without that much of a concern of how this would fit in to the Korean corporate law system on the ground. It was a very U.S. solution to this, right? And so I'm not disagreeing with you. I think it's a valid point. Maybe the World Bank is better than some of the local, even with this. But I do also think you have to look at where is the World Bank coming from. Why did this work its way into the Doing Business Index? Because Jankoff did his paper. So I don't think it would have played as prominent a role in the index if it wasn't him. No, I don't know him. I know of his work. He's terrific. He's skilled and everything. And you draw on your own knowledge. But it's not a neutral body that's some sort of omnipotent force that can work out the relationships. I do think there are certain assumptions that are built in, especially in the Asian context. I do think you have a lot of corporate governance change which has taken place, a lot flowing from the Asian financial crisis that was very much built on prior knowledge based on an Anglo-American perspective.
Something that is fixed. Because part of the spirit of what you were saying was, look, this whole enterprise, having some bureaucrat in Washington somewhere else, doing this stuff is hopeless. And there's another approach that said, this group did it poorly, but in the future, the ECGI will take it over, fix a couple of things, will focus on controlling
So I think this discussion has been helpful for me to soften my conclusion, and I don't know what Umakan thinks as well, but I do think that, yes, if there was a body that involved sort of in-depth analysis of the legal problems, you could probably work out some better way of doing this with many different perspectives regionally and much more diversity. It would take a lot of heavy lifting. My feeling is that the original paper, my feeling is the original paper was an academic paper, so they want to get it done, they want to get it out. Also the World Bank, you go to 190 countries, are you going to ask lawyers in Singapore not just to fill out the questionnaire, but then go into the in-depth analysis of the case law to figure it out, and then you have to do that in 190 countries, and you get back these long answers? How do you then code them, right? So it would become a very long-term intensive project. I don't think, in this world, nothing is impossible. I think, yeah, maybe you could do it, but it would take a lot more resources, a lot more time, and a lot more careful thinking to create something which I think would be significantly better. I don't think it would be useful for every purpose, but I do think there could be a purpose to it. Yes. Yes.
Interest
Yes.
with questions. There's also one admonishment which disappeared meanwhile. You kill it. 4 questions. And
Okay.
perhaps you should start answering.
Yes, so should the World Bank stop producing the the RPT index? Okay, can you explain the hypothetical used to construct the index? Can you explain the hypothetical used to
It's up to you which
yield? Okay, so that is an interesting, the one about the hypothetical and how it would yield invalid results in the case of group or family firms. I think when you have the hypothetical that is sent to the lawyers that is used in the index, I think what the problem with that is that it is a classic related party transaction where an outsider, if they are given a proper ex ante disclosure and proper ex post remedies, could easily sue on that. That would not be that problematic if they were given the right formula and maybe contingency fees to properly incentivize the lawsuit to be brought. I think when you're dealing with a group company type situation where you have many transactions going on between the parties and they're mispriced at a very small level, but over time it's massive amounts of wealth tunneling, that is a lot harder to get at with the tools of trying to bring a one-off lawsuit for a massive, a clear breach of directors' duties. So in that type of group situation or family firm type of situation, I think you're dealing with a different problem which requires a different solution, right? And so that's how it would be fundamentally different, which would mean the tools that are being highlighted are not the right tools to use, right? And I think a lot more thinking has to be done about how you deal with ensuring that in related party transactions that are repeat related party transactions, they tend to be good things, as opposed to being just pure wealth tunneling, which has negative consequences. The one thing you can say within the Asian context is if you go through, and this is also what sort of irritated us about the assumption that related party transactions are bad. If you think of all the Asian miracles, whether it's keiretsu, chaebol, state-owned enterprises, or family firms, that is the best of Asian corporate governance, right? In that has been the backbone of the development in the Asian miracle economies. Now, it's not saying that the Asian miracle economies are perfect. There's corporate governance problems, and for sure there's been wealth tunneling. But there is, I think, definitive evidence over a long period of time that these group structures, you know, I always say, and I debate with Professor Kim, and my Korean friends at Seoul National, who tend to be a bit more negative about the chaebol, I always say I use a Samsung phone. And at the end of the day, it's a very competitive industry, and they are producing this product at the end of the day. And yes, there could be some shaving off with the family in that, but you know, there is something to be said for the way that Samsung, for instance, has been governed, right? And you could say the same in Singapore and in other places. So that is how it is different, and that is why I think these sort of repeat related party transactions are far more complicated, far more difficult to get at than the one-off related party transaction. And actually, Professor Kim knows more about this than me because he has focused on this in Luca's book project, yes. Okay. Is Singapore much better than Malaysia? This is a question that Singaporeans ask about everything. Yeah, so I would say, again, it takes, it would take in-depth analysis, and there has been some empirical research. There's not as much research as you would expect in Singapore empirically on related party transactions. But is the business environment better? I would say if you talk to a business person on the ground or an investor, it is infinitely better. Yes, in terms of corporate governance, in terms of corruption, and so I don't think if a person sees Malaysia next to Singapore in a ranking on good governance, that a person who is not in the World Bank or not an academic but involved in industry, I think they would look at it and almost dismiss it. Yes. Yes.
Yes. I guess what really puzzles me about all of this is about 5 years ago, I guess, or 4 years ago, when we started the project on corporate governance in Asia, as we were part of a group together, I very clearly, recollect our first meeting with all the East Asian scholars saying, oh, well, we come way down in the rankings of all these international rankings, and that's just outrageous because look how well the Asian economy is performing. So, what's happened that you are now at the top? And if it is based on, well, we've all got, common law regulation in terms of related party transactions, I mean, why isn't a tie at number 1 or number 2 for England, Australia, Singapore? What's differentiating Kenya and Singapore from the mother country of, where you've taken your regulations from?
So in terms of going back in time, East Asia, meaning sort of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, PRC, China, have always done very poor in these type of rankings. Singapore, we've always done very well. Yes. Yeah. So just a correction on that point. Singapore has been at the top of all both the Asian corporate governance ranking and the World Bank ranking and the overall doing business ranking. Singapore 10 years in a row was number 1. We got displaced by New Zealand last year. We're number 2 out of 190 on the overall ranking. So Singapore has always done exceptionally well in these rankings. There's a reason for that, both an authentic reason, but there's also a reason in that Singapore pays very close attention to this, and they have a reason to pay close attention to it, right? It's a country of 6 million people. It is not Japan that has 120 million people. It's not China that has 1 billion people. So Singapore has to be aware of the signal that it sends out, and it relies on foreigners trusting Singapore, and so the rankings probably play a greater role, and there's greater reason for Singapore to pay attention to it. In terms of the mother countries, the UK is always in the top 10. The US is in the top 10. Australia's in the top 10. New Zealand's in the top 10 all the time in these, and particularly in the RPT one. 9 out of the top 10 are common law or Commonwealth countries. The question is that because you start from a starting point, which was a bit of my response to Lucien's point, if your starting point is this is being constructed by people with an understanding of the common law, then the index tests whether or not you're part of the common law. And it becomes a proxy for how well you've kept up with the mother country. Right now, you may say, well, how did Singapore get ahead of the UK? They get ahead on 1 point, right? So it's a very marginal difference between those top 10. But they're all very much bunched together because they do the same things, and the people creating the index have that understanding. I would be curious if the world was a different place and you had people from civil law countries creating your index, what would the ranking look like? I would suspect that maybe Germany would be number 1, and you would have France as number 2, and it would go like this, right? And Japan would rise up, and Korea would rise up, and these countries with these backgrounds would rise up. And that would be because they've projected their knowledge and expectations onto the index, and it fulfills their understanding of what good law is, and that's how you get the index, right? So again, it has to do with, and I think this is a very powerful thing we have in this room, is we do have a mix of common civil law, mixed jurisdiction, different backgrounds, different regions. And I think if you are going to do something properly, it is to get that understanding from a comparative basis of corporate governance, and maybe then you can do a better job with it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.